Good morning, people. It's been a very long time since I've done any meaningful video work here. I've been a very busy man. Certainly, a lot of work here locally in Vancouver, both on my own boat and on others, as well as getting my dad's new ship together for him to use this season. Certainly, there's been a lot of water going by here that has taken my time away from this sort of activity and towards other things. All in all, things here are going well enough, as most of us face. I'm sure there's a certain amount of trepidation, maybe more so in North America than some places. It really depends on your geographic locale in terms of how confident you are in your ability to navigate the near future. We don't need to get into the geopolitical that deeply here. I'm not sure in a lot of ways it makes a lot of difference for the average man. I often see the geopolitical as an expression of the personality of the individual. Very typically, the leader of a particular country is that which embodies the personality of that country best, like that or not. It is my opinion at this moment in history that the average individual is so conflicted and so schizoid and so devoid of anything resembling coherence in their personality or even their self. It is conspicuous to me that for most people, their reality is simply a collection of cherry picked narratives that suit various and competing internal instinctive interests. It doesn't surprise me that what passes for policy or mandate or any of the rest is just a very silly, glued together, rubber stamp, word salad approach to everything. You can't expect that people who have no coherence internally would expect coherence externally. For those of us who value internal coherence and meaningful relationship, both internally and externally, this is certainly a very difficult moment to find one's way in. And don't get the idea that I'm making any political claims either about the false dichotomy of left versus right or any of the rest of that. It is so rare that I meet an individual with sufficient enough perspective or in possession of a thoughtful enough ideology that words like left versus right make any sense. Again, it's just a collection of preferences. There's nothing there deeper than that. They simply vote for the things that immediately in the short term suit them. Voting may be something like that in itself. I'm not a voter myself. I think really the dismay for the thoughtful individual is it's really a choice of, if there's a choice, what kind of suicide bus one wants to ride to the inevitable conclusion. And you can get on one brand of suicide bus that's hell-bent on flying off a cliff, driven by people that prefer a certain kind of cocktail or another. But you don't really have the choice to not ride the bus. That choice is being made for you, mostly. The ethical concern of the moment that I find myself reflecting on is precisely this. It's not a matter of what kind of death cult collapse seeking insanity one wants to participate in, but rather how an individual finds enough autonomy personally in a meaningful and practical sense to step away from that and dispossess oneself of participation and hopefully culpability in what the inevitable is bound to be. That is my primary concern, and it's an idea that consumes a great deal of my time. It's interesting to me too, because it's gotten to be just about 20 years ago that I wrote my book titled Seasteading, and all the rest of that adventure that came on the tail end of that. It was certainly interesting to publish that book and present the kind of idea that I had, in contrast of being the typical vacationing yachtsman, but rather looking at the maritime environment and my lifestyle, such as I enjoy it, that is much more akin to a homesteading environment than it is, purely an adventure or a recreational activity. It is how I live my life. The boat is my home. It is a business. It is a career. It is all that in the way of a homesteader. Certainly, when the Wired magazine crowd got a hold of that term and they turned it into some crazy notion about nation building on the high seas, an idea that's never gone anyplace, of course, because it would not be supported by any maritime country. I mean, that was clear. They had a vision of it being some kind of weird libertarian tax dodge situation, I guess. I don't know. It's kind of died down now, gone away, in spite of all the funding that went into it for a while. It was a dumb idea from the start, but I have to admit that my own perspective there, from the motif of, say, traditional homesteading, as well, was not as thoughtful as it could have been, and my ideas on that have evolved a good deal. And while I still live the lifestyle, the attitude that I have about it and the way that I would encourage people to think about it has evolved significantly, and I think for the better. And I hope to get into that a little bit today, and it is a bit of a heavy conversation, but it gets into material that I think the average person who is seeking to dispossess themselves from the moment and retreat to a place of more sanity and internal unity. The view that I'm going to offer you, I think you'll find quite valuable, and that there is a practical gateway here to healing these internal schisms that all of us feel just by circumstance and necessity, to heal those in a manner that we can, from a much more grounded posture, face these external uncertainties in a difficult future with much more courage and much more autonomy. So let's think about that a little bit. Now, a lot of this thinking comes to me as a result of the experiences that I had on the big island of Hawaii, being very involved in the sustainable agriculture movement there and having a small acreage of my own, researching canoe plants, as would be kind of the sort of thing that fits in naturally with my boating lifestyle, and making an attempt personally to see what it really meant to live a independent, autonomous, sustainable lifestyle. Like, that's something I didn't want to just dabble with, but actually achieve. And I got pretty close to being able to do it. Okay. And what I discovered is that it was a tremendous lot of hard work, and that it meant a tremendously impoverished lifestyle. And it also meant that, in spite of one seeking security and autonomy, there were vulnerabilities there that aren't immediately apparent. And these vulnerabilities are not immediately apparent for good reason. The idea among at least we little people that the private ownership of some parcel of land is a good that cannot be questioned, that it is something that is inherently valuable, that it conveys a kind of mythos that rises to a level of religion in a lot of people's minds. It does not take a great deal of reflection to see the problems. It's just that it is one of those unsupported assumptions that the private ownership of land leads towards one's liberty. It is so fundamental to our culture that the very glaring vulnerabilities never get questioned. It is a matter of fact that civilizations that base themselves on the private ownership of property as a fundamental collapse. Civilizations collapse. They all collapse. And it does not take that long for them to collapse. There are certainly cultures of individuals who do not believe in the private ownership of land, and they do not collapse. There are cultures that do not believe in the private ownership of land who have gone 15 millennia in a manner that had a harmonious relationship with their neighbors and their environment. That isn't hypothetical. Now, it's certainly the case that those cultures get overrun and they get conquered by cultures that have a more aggressive relationship to the land, at least in the short term. But we should ask ourselves why, and fundamentally why, the private ownership of property is a common denominator in the collapse of human societies. And it is not hard to discern with a certain amount of reflection, and that is this: your claim to ownership. Ownership is distinct from possession. We can get to that. But your claim to ownership, an abstraction, that this abstractly defined square piece of 40 acres is yours, is only possible in an environment in which there is a hierarchy that respects your claim of ownership for a fee and will exact violence on other individuals who choose to not respect that claim. Now, there are people out there who believe silly notions like some family can defend themselves against groups of marauders and hold off, I don't know, people that do not respect their claims of ownership by force. I mean, that's a fantasy that seems to somehow get trotted out over and over again. But in reality, without having a larger hierarchy of authority that defends you for a fee, the individual's really pretty helpless against any kind of outside um, interests that happen to not respect your claim. But the problem is, if you are one of those individuals that are seeking autonomy and liberty, the kind of autonomy and liberty you seek may not jive well with the kind of autonomy and liberty that hierarchical authority that you are dependent on is willing to offer you. And very often, especially as cultures go further and they become more resource intensive, and the demand for energetic inputs in order to maintain the capacity for violence and enforcement of claim go on, the aims of that state, which you're dependent on for your notion of ownership, and your idea of what liberty looks like, well, those two views are very likely to diverge. And I think anybody who would not see that for the average individual, maybe if you're wealthy, this is not the case, but for the average individual, the aims of the state and the aims of the individuals are really at cross purposes. Now, I know full well someone will not have heard what I said particularly well, or will have been highly conditioned by knee-jerk perspectives that they've been fed. Let me be completely clear. I am not advocating for communism. All right? That's not what I'm getting at here at all. In fact, I think the important thing that we should take away from this is it matters to the individual who seeks liberty very little whether they claim to own the land and pay government a fee for the privilege of doing that, or whether government owns the land and they pay government a fee for the usage of it. I think it matters very little. What I'm advocating for is a awareness of the objective fact that the most persistent cultures that human beings have ever created saw the private ownership of land as an evil in itself. And I think that a individual who is thoughtful about the idea that they are living in a world where hierarchical authority is moving in a direction and towards the future and is asserting values that are at odds with one's own, the leverage of participating in an ownership culture makes it very, very difficult for the person to retain any autonomy and some kind of gateway to dispossess oneself of the dependence that one has on hierarchical authority is necessary if one wants to be an autonomous actor. And it is, again, very important to question whether or not that's possible. Within a system that operates in the manner that ours does. So what I'm really advocating here for is a kind of posture that goes far beyond homesteading, because homesteading, again, as I've been forced to confront, is still a activity that is dependent on a larger hierarchical system that doesn't share my values. and in fact is pursuing values that are contrary to my own survival. And if I'm interested as an autonomous individual in pursuing my own survival, somehow I have to dispossess myself from dependence as much as possible from that reality. So in many ways, using the model of homesteading for what I envision is inappropriate. And much more so, it resembles a kind of posture that I would probably call Neo-Indigenous. The Neo meaning new, but the indigenous meaning individuals who live in a particular relational posture to their habitat, one that does not elevate the idea of ownership, that they look at their relationship to that whole as a perhaps higher order, but symbiotic participant within a ecological niche, rather than a something that is impressed artificially and abstractly on top of it, such as the idea of ownership. And the boat lifestyle easily works into that kind of idea. You are, if you're thoughtful about it, you are someone who lives within a habitat with the absence of any claim of ownership to the habitat. And it makes for a very good starting point to build a strategy of personal autonomy that I don't think can be found while one is so still wedded within a system of rule by violence and the rest. And a lot of this at its core is about violence and about power and the rest, and the strategies that we choose to use to move through life and relate not only to hierarchical authority, but ourselves and the people that we care about. I mean, obviously, trauma and violence begets trauma and violence. And it's very difficult for people who have either engaged in or been the recipient of trauma or violence to have the courage to try to use anything other than trauma and violence, because trauma and violence are powerful tools. And certainly it is true that individuals who heal can heal other people, and definitely healing begets healing of other people and healers too. It's just, again, in our culture of hierarchical authority, where you're always thinking about your dues that you must pay to the king, trauma comes to you for free, but healing costs money. And it's very nearly impossible that any positive can outweigh the ubiquitous harm. The ubiquitous harm that simply is a product of the way we've chosen to relate to the world. So I hope some of you have found this relatively interesting. It is a very countercultural view, if not extra-cultural. It is a view that is not opposed, but in fact alien to the way that we have come to think about our relationship to the land or life as a product of how we've decided to run our culture for the last 500 years. It shouldn't surprise us that we've not thought about it. Often in conversations that I get into with people about comparative religion and the rest, I will be asked why it is that, for example, you might know who Jesus Christ is, but not Mithra or Mani. And I think for anybody that's read Jesus Christ, who didn't write anything, or Mani or Mithra or others, it becomes quite clear that you know about the religious traditions that are useful to the king. The ones that are not useful to the king and the ones that actually elevate personal liberty, the king was very interested in stomping those out. And when it comes to ways of thinking about economics or ecology or any of the rest of these things, or how to relate to other people, the methodologies that are useful to the king are the ones that you hear about the most. It has nothing to do with whether or not they have merit or not. If they have merit to the king, you're familiar with it. And this is in spite of the fact that what I'm advocating for here is a view that was probably more normal within human existence than anything that we hold as true today. Humanity, for most of its history, embraced a very practical, life-affirming relationship, understanding viscerally that it was the relationship that one had acting within one's habitat that made life possible. And certainly there were ideas of something that might resemble good or evil, I guess, although not nearly defined as much as they might be after the king and his hierarchical authority comes along. You might say that good is that which puts the collective ahead of the personal, and you might say that evil is that which puts the personal ahead of the collective. But for an individual that is interested in life, it's quite easy to see that on either end of those spectrums, the extreme good and the extreme evil are both life-denying strategies. And if your primary relationship is to life, that in the here and now, and that which is what you are living in the moment rather than some abstraction, well, this will resonate with you. Anyway, I thought I would share this a little bit and see if there's interest in pursuing this rabbit hole, because it is a deep, deep one. But I think for a lot of people, if they just shed themselves of a few unsupported assumptions and possess themselves of a couple of strategies, one can find that becoming in possession of some real meaningful autonomy in a world that wants to deny it to you is very possible. But you can't do it if you're living in a house that's divided fundamentally against itself. That's clear. So looking forward to hearing if there's any feedback here, and if it's interesting, we'll pursue this conversation. Thanks for listening.